quiet stock. I took the breakfast shift because it fit around my mother's appointments and because no one else wanted to be in the high school kitchen before dawn, when the steam table clanked to life and the building sounded hollow as a silo. I could be there by 5, get the line set, fruit cups, yogurt, those plastic pouches of cereal that tear crooked, and still make it to the clinic with her by 10 on Tuesdays. The work was steady and unshowy. You learn a rhythm. Pull the racks, check the gaskets, listen for the little cough in the dish machine pump. That means the drain line is starting to fur up with lime. You salt the slush on the loading dock, bang the ice loose from the trap on walk-in door, and if the radio is behaving, you let some morning talk show leak into the tile, so you're not alone with the hum. Bellwater High sat out on Fulson Road next to the salt barn and the old concrete fence plant with its mute stacks. In September, you could smell the hay when somebody ripped the doors off the barn for a late cutting. By October, the mornings were iron cold and the plow trucks clattered past with chains wrapped lazy around their tailgates. This fall, the district had cut 2 kitchen positions and folded breakfast into lunch, which meant we ladled gravy at 6 and spaghetti at 10 and swept a thin film of tomato off the floor until July. The money wasn't good, but there was a kind of peace in working with your hands when that was the only part of your life that still did what it was told. I was the kind of person who counted how many clicks the convection ovens made when they cycled down. I knew the faint whistle where the air curtain leaked over the south door. You could hear it if you stood under the bulkhead and held your breath, a needle thread of air that tickled the skin between your ear and your jaw. I liked to give the slicer a coat of oil with the thin end of a towel so it kept its shine. I kept the magnetic strip lined with knives like grey fish. The dishwasher, a big stainless box that took up a whole wall, had a way of clearing its throat that sounded like a person starting to say a name and then thinking better of it. On Monday in late November, a custodian named Ray rolled a stack of old crates into the kitchen and told us to pick what we wanted before it went to the dump. He said they'd finally cleaned out the home EC room down by the locker annex. "Haven't had a sewing machine in there since my oldest had a mullet," he said, and then he backed his cart away, one squeaky wheel marking a dotted line across the terrazzo. The crates were full of glassware and chipped bowls and old recipe pamphlets with ladies in aprons, smiling like they'd been praised for standing in a certain spot. There was a metal tin with a dent in the lid that gave me the brief thought of a thumb pressed too hard, and a set of wooden spoons that had been chewed to velvet on one side. Under a stack of rolled placemats, I found a shoebox taped shut. The tape broke with that soft sound that reminds you of unsticking a bandage. Inside were index cards and little scraps of paper, all in different hands. A lot of the cards had grease petals in the corners where fingers had pinched them. My mother kept a box like it when we lived on 64th, a shut-in bouquet of the kinds of things she used to make when my father still came home before midnight. Seeing the box was like walking into an old smell. I cut an ovoid out of the tape with my thumbnail and fanned the cards. Some were in English, some in a messy, slanted handwriting that looked like it knew more than it would say. The second card from the bottom was brown around the edges, the way paper gets when it's been near a stove too many winters. It was brittle and it crackled a little when I bent it enough to read. The top line said, "Brodo con gnocchi," and below that, in smaller letters that narrowed like a whisper traveling through a pipe, someone had written, "Keep silence after flour meets water." I don't spook easy. A kitchen is full of noises that could be something and never are. The compressor kicks on, and the sheet pan on the rack gives a tick, and your heart thinks it goes a step. You learn to separate the sounds that belong from the ones that don't. This was ink on paper. Still, my hand did a small thing, like it wanted to pull back just a touch and didn't. The card had a smell that wasn't dust, not exactly. It was faint, like if you put a nickel in your mouth on a cold day and breathed through your nose. I flipped it over. On the back, another line read, "If the word slips, keep the spout inside the pot." I laughed at myself for feeling watched and slid the card back into the box, but it ticked in my head for the rest of the morning. The lunch menu had us making gravy out of milk and flour, and those pouches of so-called sausage crumble that looked like dog food, if you're not generous in your heart. I stood at the stove with a whisk in one hand and thought about that sentence. Keep silence after flour meets water. Flour and milk wasn't water, but it was near enough, neighbors with a shared driveway. I tried the idea on like a jacket from a thrift rack while I cooked. It didn't fit, but there was a length to the sleeve that made me feel my wrist in a new way. I got home by 2 with my mother, groceries sliding soft in the trunk and the heater pushing out not quite warm air. Her apartment smelled the way old aluminum smells if you heat it empty. She stayed in her chair by the window because she could watch the street and tell me what time it was from the way the long shadow of the telephone pole crossed over the driveway of the fourplex next door. "You take the early bus," she said, whenever a school kid hopped off and went past in a hoodie, "or you don't take the bus at all." On the stove, the little pot I used to coax her to eat sat with a rim of soup turned varnish. She liked it when I made her the bow tie noodles with chicken broth, salting it until the back of my tongue gave me a little slap. The pot was an old one from when we lived with my aunt, the bottom blacked in a pattern that looked like a map of a river lacing a delta. I set the groceries on the counter so she could see I'd found her the crackers with the little scallops on the edge, the ones she'd grown up calling shells. She nodded like it was about time, and I put water on. And when it simmered, I shook in some powdered bouillon because the good stuff costs and we were past that. I was thinking about the card while the steam put its hand on my face. It felt stupid to be thinking about it, the way you feel stupid when a superstition tugs your sleeve, but it kept tugging. There was flour in the canister by the coffee tins, and there was water rolling in the pot. I imagined it as if it would matter, as if quiet around that moment would keep anything from happening or let something else happen that wouldn't otherwise. I don't know if I could have said why I didn't turn the radio on while I rolled the dough. Maybe it was the card, and maybe it was how the building creaked in the cold, and maybe it was a little of both. I tipped flour onto the counter and ran my fingers through it, and somewhere on the block, a truck let off its brakes and made that long sigh that sounds human. I measured nothing and everything by feel, adding water to the flour until it came together, shaggy to smooth, a change you feel in your palm like a person's weight when they decide to stand up. The kitchen got quiet in the way sound gets quiet when you are trying to thread a needle. I wasn't thinking about spells, not for real. I was thinking about the name on the card and how someone nonna had written those words and how names hang around kitchens like steam that doesn't go anywhere. The pot rattled the way thin pots do, and I pinched bits off the dough, thumbed them against a fork, made those little dents that catch sauce and salt. When I slid the first piece into the water, it disappeared with a hush. I wanted to turn the radio on then, because the hush felt too much like a thing, but my hand didn't move. "Keep silence after flour meets water," said my head in a voice that wasn't mine and also was. I checked on my mother. She was turning the pages of a magazine she'd already read. She licked her finger to separate the thickness, and there was flour on my own fingers, and now the flour was in the water, and I was quiet. I was quiet as a church before the first cough. It felt like a game until my mother said a name. She didn't shout. Her voice doesn't rise anymore. She whispered the way someone does at the movies because they want to share something right when a loud part is about to hit. "Sal," she said, in the middle of the quiet, and the spoon IRD left on the counter rocked by itself like it had a small heart. We hadn't spoken about Sal in a long time. We hadn't said my father's name like it belonged to us since the last time we saw him, which had been 8 winters back, the night a car idled in our drive with the lights on for an hour, and my mother stood by the door with her coat on, not fronting like she wasn't waiting. "He was good with a level," she said sometimes, like that absolved anything. "He could make a shelf right to a hair." "Don't," I said, which was stupid and also too late. Because the word was already out in the steam, with the flakes of flour I debreathed. The pot made a sound like someone tapping a glass with the edge of a ring. When I lifted the lid, the water had turned the color of tea. It wasn't brown like a burn. It was more like a stain, spreading in paper, slow and uneven. I got the spoon and pushed the dumplings in a little circle, and the spoon met something on the bottom that wasn't the dumplings. It was a scab of something thin that tugged against the metal and then let go. I dipped the spoon under and brought it up. What came up looked like amber leaf and stuck to the bowl of the spoon in a way that made me think of candy gone wrong. The surface of the thing had something on it. It took a second to see what I was seeing because my brain wanted to see steam and broth and the old pot S black and anything else but this. There was a word in the varnish. 5 letters raised into the surface, like something written with the wrong end of a nail. The way you D write in a cake of soap if you were bored and not afraid of your grandmother. Sal. I blinked and it was still there. The steam dampened my forehead. If I moved the spoon, so the light from the window dragged across the varnish, the letters flashed like gold. The line of the S was a little crooked, the way my mother's writing had been before her hand started telling lies. The A had a long tail. The L was a short nail hammered in just far enough to hold. I said nothing. My neck felt cold and my arms felt hot. I had the sudden thought of turning the radio on loud and pretending I'd never seen what I'd seen. But the radio S plug was wound around itself like a knot somebody made for the pleasure of untying, and my hands wouldn't do it. I tapped the spoon on the rim of the pot the way you do when you want gravity to decide for you. And the varnish slid back into the water in a sheet, the thickness of breath, and vanished against the metal. I ladled bowls and brought one to my mother and watched her face for a sign she had seen it too, a flinch at the rim of the pot, a glance at her own mouth like a word had jumped back out. She lifted the spoon and chewed like it was effort, and all she said was, "You put too much salt," which is the same thing she said when it was right. I didn't sleep much that night. The light from the street hit the blinds and made a ladder on the ceiling, and I tried to climb it with my eyes and fell every rung. When I did sleep, I dreamed about the dish machine throat clearing and woke with a taste of dirty pennies in my mouth. The next morning, the world had that brittle sound it gets when the temperature stays below freezing for 2 days, and my breath in the dark looked like I held my tongue in a fog. The box with the cards sat on the top of the fridge, where I'd set it without thinking. It looked like a thing a person leaves for themselves when they want to see if they can stand not touching it. I told myself it was something with the starch. I told myself there was residue in the pot from the bouillon and the flour and the nickel taste of our water, and that it had nothing to do with the name. I said aloud to no one, "No!" the way you tell a dog to stop chewing a door, and then I told myself I had a shift to get to and a school to feed. The kitchen at Bellwater was a rectangle of tile and steel with a wheeled island you could lock in place with your hip. The reach-in freezer had a dent in the lower panel where someone had kicked it and then nobody admitted it. The dish pit floor always had a sheen that didn't quite come up no matter how much you put your back into the brush. We were meant to bleach and rinse and bleach again until the sink smelled like a motel pool. The radio gave us the weather and the news and the ad jingles for a tire place in the next county. The fluorescent lights hummed about as loud as your own blood. I tried not to think about the card and thought of nothing else. I worked quiet because the walk-in was cold enough to make your words fall out of your mouth and crack on the floor. I whisked the morning S gravy and flattened the lumps against the side of the pan. And when I turned off the burner, when the milk and the flour and everything had come together into one thing the way you can separate out once it S married, I did something stupid. I unspooled the radio cord. It knocked once against the toaster prep sink and then came free. And I set the radio near the stove and turned the little notch and let the voice inside it promise me the traffic was light. Then I turned it off when I heard myself breathing along with the weatherman S list of digits, like the numbers might add up to something I didn't want to be present for. I ladled gravy into hotel pans for the hotline. We decided to keep breakfast simple. Biscuits with gravy, scrambled eggs that came by the bag, fruit cocktail that came by the gallon in syrup they swore was light. The kids barely looked at the food when they came through. Some of them didn't meet your eye, and some would look right into your face like they knew where you lived. They took the heavy trays with both hands and angled toward the end of the line where Poppy would swipe their numbers. If the scanner didn't beep, she'd say, "Try again, hun." And that was the extent of our policy on hunger. On the third day, after the thing in my own kitchen, the district sent an email that said there had been incidents at 2 other schools, and until they assessed, they wanted the staff to institute quiet lunch. The letter used that capital Q, the way administrators do when they want you to know they invented it. Quiet lunch would run for 3 days, possibly a week, with no phones, no talking, nothing but hushed eating and quick exits. Poppy laughed out loud when she read it. "As if in this world," she said, and she crumpled the paper and popped it in the cardboard bin like she was making a shot at the buzzer. They got the principal to make an announcement before first period. His voice in the kitchen was flat and official through the speaker. It made the tomato soup feel chemical. He said there'd been some disturbing behaviors at Greenwood Middle involving chanting during meals, and some at the elementary school I couldn't place involving what he called ritual whispering. It didn't take long for the kids to call it the vow. They gave each other looks that were half fear and half thrill. Adults telling them to be quiet and eat felt like old times to the older ones, and some of the younger ones got shaky. Poppy and I said nothing to each other. We stocked napkins and filled the condiment pumps and filled the air with the smells we always filled it with. Metal and steam and the sharp sweet of oranges when you cut the case open, cloves and allspice from the pre-made pie slices, whatever it is that lives where milk meets heat. By the second day of quiet lunch, the look in the kids' eyes had changed. It wasn't entirely bad. It was awake. Silence does that. It crawls into your head and rubs around and makes your thoughts show up clear like foil you forgot to peel off a pan. A girl with a knit hat pulled down to her eyebrows held her tray straight-armed like a waitress in training and looked past me at the gravy as if it knew something. You could hear the small sounds our work usually covered: the quarter turn of a stool at a table, the clack of crossed plastic forks, the cold tinkle of ice in a styrofoam cup, when the boy at the end of the line filled and overfilled and then stopped filling and walked like glass carried him. The dish machine cleared its throat and someone near the window flinched so hard their spoon clipped their teeth. The third day, the superintendent came through the line with a smile that didn't touch his eyes and told us we were doing a great job and not to let the kids push. He said the incidents at Greenwood had been resolved and the whispering at homes was probably TikTok, which is what they said about anything they couldn't fix with a printout. He was the kind of man who used the word team like it cost us nothing and him even less. When he left, Poppy cracked open 3 sleeves of foam cups and said, "Heard his wife is living over the river," which was the kind of thing people said around here like it was both gossip and weather. I took the silent part seriously, which surprised me. It had grown on me the way some smells do, like fresh-cut drywall or a new roll of masking tape. I liked the way the stainless caught the light unbroken by talk. I liked the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, shadowed by linoleum and dust. You see how your own noise works when you stop making it. The dish machine sounded like a person trying to be brave. The compressor came on like a dog laying down heavy on its side. The fluorescent lights buzzed like a cloud of bees stuck in a jar that you've told yourself is far enough away. After the rush, I cleaned the stove and set the pots to boil. I had my card from the box in the pocket of my apron and felt it every time I wiped my hands and slid the rag back into the belt loop I used as a holster. I told myself that if I could put the thing in the context of flour thickening a sauce in a public place, I'd see what I needed to see. Something explained is something you can walk around. The card had that faint coin smell. It lived in my pocket like a second pulse. We made chicken noodle most Fridays because it was cheap and it kept kids in their seats. The district sent us the boxes with the bouillon and the protein powder and the dehydrated mirepoix, each in its own bag with a little window like a dollhouse pantry. I chopped celery for myself because I liked the way it made the smell honest. I dumped flour into my smallest mixing bowl and measured water by eye and dumped the flour in and set the bowl near the stove. It felt childish, like I was making a potion in front of the grown-ups. Still, I waited. I looked at Poppy. She was counting trays. She half counted out loud like she always did. I wanted her to stop, and then I didn't want that. You can ask people to go along with what you won to put a name to. The line would be back in 20 minutes. There was no time to stand in a kitchen and make a rule out of thin air. The radio had been off since first bell because the main office said so, but the radio doesn't keep that rule inside itself. It holds the idea of noise. My fingers touched the knob like I had to balance against the counter to get the right angle. I turned it up just enough to hear the advertisement on the other side of the commercial talk show. A man's voice made the word guarantee mean something without telling me what. I turned it down slow and then off, and the room changed back the way a pond goes back to flat when you let the rock you were going to throw sit heavy in your palm. I watched the bowl. The way flour meets water isn't special if you're looking for special. It clumps, tries to be one thing and then fails, and you stir it and eventually your stirring becomes the thing. I'd done this 1,000 times and made gravy for 100,000 breakfasts that people ate without looking at. And there was nothing in it but food and work. I moved the whisk. The pot was a good one, thick-bottomed and even, not like my mother's. The steam rose with that sweet, milky leaf smell that has a little metal in it if you know what to watch for. The flour went into the water. I made myself quiet, and something in me leaned toward the hush, like a dog will turn its head to catch a sound. Poppy's voice wasn't even loud. She said, "You pull the racks, Marco," which is my name, and everyone calls me Mark except my mother, but Poppy has always done exactly what she liked. She said it because it was a thing we say every day. She said it because the racks need pulling. She said it because the students were about to hit the door. She said it because that is what humans do. We put sounds in the air while the pot goes through its little changes. She said it and no one died, which feels stupid to write down, but is how the brain begins to measure things when it has a new yardstick. The broth did something with its surface that made my mouth taste like pennies. It wasn't the color of the chicken that came out of a box. It was the color of a table ring left by a glass of water that sweated itself wet. I took the stirrer and ran it along the bottom the way I'd done at home in the dim of my mother's kitchen. The spoon caught. You know your own pots. You know the swells where they take. This was a catch with an argument in it, like the metal had decided it wanted to say. I lifted the spoon. Say what you want about coincidences. Say what you like about brains that want to see patterns, counting grooves in a forklift tire and calling it mathematics. The spoon came up with a laminate of broth turned into something else, a sheet as thin as cellophane, except it didn't crinkle and didn't crack. It shone with a wetness that wasn't slick, more like you see in amber when there's something stuck inside. I saw the letters before I saw the letters. My brain made space for them like you part a curtain before you know why you're redoing it. M-A-R-C-O. The C sloped wrong because nobody in this kitchen ever wrote my name down with the C in the right place. The O at the end was small. The A looked like a little house left in a flood. They were raised into the varnish in a way that made me think of the way Poppy smooths icing with the back of a spoon when she gets bored and ends up practicing letters like a child. I didn't breathe for a second, and then I did, slow, because the body tricks the mind when it feels like its person is about to be stupid. "You okay?" Poppy said, and she was peering around the edge of the convention oven at me in a way that told me she didn't think I was okay and didn't want more work if it wasn't her turn. I lowered the spoon. The varnish slid back into the broth like it had never been up in the air. The surface shivered and then went flat, with a skin that looked like it would peel if you made a knife in it, and lifted careful. "Fine," I said, which is a word like a bandage. I served the soup. I watched the kids bring their faces close and breathe oniony clouds out their noses. I watched one boy put his hand around the cup like he felt cold. I watched them taste. I watched them not die. I watched the line go back into the layer of noise the school makes even when it is quiet, the foot traffic and the throat clearing and the chair legs. I watched because what else was there to do? I had work. The racks needed pulling. At home that night, my mother asked for the bow tie noodles like she had every day for a week, and I said we could do something else, and she said, "Don't." Because understanding new things takes energy. And hers went to watching the shadow of the pole, tracking across the driveway, and to getting up in time for the clinic, and to being the person she was. I put water on, because water is what you do when the day wears a path in your head. I turned the radio down. I rolled flour with water into a ball with my palms, and felt the change from sticky to soft. I thought of the card, and its ink, and its brittle edge. I thought of the way the varnish gave names back in a way that made them feel like fossils, that tone of forever you hear in a word that's been here longer than your breath. I didn't want to say a name. I didn't want her to say one. I wanted to put the pot on the back burner and go stand in the hallway and count cracked tiles until the hunger and the thought both passed. I didn't. My mother said, "You hear about Poppy's sister? She's gone down to the river town. The one with the ferry." And she was just talking, filling the quiet in the way she used to fill the apartment when the old shows came on. She said Poppy and I looked at the pot and held the spoon hard enough that my knuckles said hello. The pot made that gentle clink I was already starting to know. I lifted the spoon. Poppy was clear as daylight in that amber glaze, all 5-letter teeth biting down on the metal with no pain. I thought of Poppy's laugh, of the way she said hon and meant it, of the way she flicked dishwater off her fingers like the droplets were moths. I thought of her sister, a person I'd never met, and the way the name floated in the kitchen air like sugar when you sift it too hard. I slid the varnish back into the pot and served my mother and woke at 2 with my mouth tasting of cold pennies and my heart having walked around the block without me. The week of quiet lunch stretched to 2. They sent another letter. They held a board meeting with the public microphone, and the worst people in town got up and shouted into it about freedom, and the principal kept his hands folded neat on the table like he was trying not to spill himself. The kids lined up and didn't talk, and some of them liked it, and some of them hated it, as you might expect, and some of them used it as a place to put a fear that had no other shelf. The floor under the dish machine kept its sheen. The walk-in door still needed a good slam to seal. The little pinhole in the hose line that fed the kettle misted my shirt sleeve when I leaned wrong. The kitchen was the kitchen, and also I now stood in it like a person standing in an old church whose beams have been found to be soft. I kept the card in my pocket like a confession. I took it out and read the back when I was alone. If the word slips, keep the spout inside the pot. I didn't know what the spout meant until a night in December when the superintendent's office asked us to contribute soup to the football banquet, because the booster mom said feeding 100 people on chafing fuel and fuss takes money the town would rather spend on a new scoreboard. We made 3 giant pots of broccoli cheddar and 2 of chicken noodle, and 1 of a tomato basil, so thick the spoon stood upright while it cooled. I was stirring, and Poppy was ladling into the insulated Cambros, and the band teacher's wife had stuck her head in to say we were saints, and then took a call about folding chairs when one of the pots on the back stove burped. It wasn't the hot salt of a boil, it was a wet belch, and I knew it from my mother's kitchen and shut my mouth like I'd seen a fly. I lifted the lid. The varnish on that pot went from a thin skin to a thick, lacquered glass right in front of me, and the first letter of a name extruded itself like a tooth. I reached for the ladle. I didn't know what else to do. Some part of my brain reported that the room smelled like copper and damp wool. Poppy was saying something across the room about how the band teacher's wife had no idea how many chairs we owned, and I didn't want to hear it out loud. The ladle moved through the soup, and when I tilted it, the varnish slid into the bowl like it had been made for the shape. The word was half there and half not. The skin on top of the soup quivered in a way that told me it was waiting. I tipped the ladle. The glaze in it sheened the way gas does on a puddle in a parking lot. I brought the ladle back to the pot and touched the tip to the surface as if the soup were a membrane I didn't want to break. The glaze slid back into the pot, and as I watched, it thinned and then disappeared, and the letters with it. The kitchen went back to the sounds a kitchen makes. A truck outside let off its brakes the way they do. The compressor kicked, and the sheet pan ticked, and the dish machine made its little cough. If the word slips, keep the spout inside the pot. A spout was the end of a ladle. A spout was the thing that stops a thing from spilling into the world. I started stirring every pot like it might be a mouth. I kept the ladle in the soup until I had to lift it. I didn't to let anything fall onto the counter I couldn't to wipe up in one swipe. I think I thought I was keeping the names in the steel. I can't explain why that felt right. It felt like keeping bees. The more you feed silence, the more it wants to build. I tried not to test it. I couldn't help myself. You can't have a scale in your hand and not weigh your own coins. On a Thursday with snow, starting on the north side of the parking lot, and the custodians putting down salt, like you might put down a question you don't want to answer, I made a pot of soup and waited, while Poppy cut a case of brownies in squares and counted them out under her breath. I thought of the girl with the knit hat. I thought of her face. Not the shape of it, but the way she'd held her tray, like a thing to be kept level. I said her name in my head, as if my head were a closed room. The pot breathed into the hush. I didn't lift the spoon. I stood still, as if motion might crack something. The varnish formed and then didn't, like the floor deciding whether or not to be ice. I half saw the start of a letter, and then it was a ripple, and then a skin, and then nothing. I decided that thinking was not saying, and I left it there. Poppy hurt her back, hoisting a Cambro into the truck for the elementary. She said she felt a pinch like a goat nipping the edge of her shirt, and then heat flashed down her leg, and then she sat hard on a crate and said some words she usually keeps for her sister. I offered to drive the soup, and she told me to take the little ramp and not the big one, and to tell the secretary to sign the form, even though we both knew they'd throw it away. In the elementary kitchen, a woman with a necklace that said Sandy opened the door with her hip and told me to be careful because the multi-purpose room floor had a dead spot that caught chair legs. I hauled the soup into the steam table and made the steam table be kind to it. The kids lined up with their mittens on a ribbon through their sleeves. Their breath bounced off their scarves and came back on their faces, and their faces did not care. "Quiet lunch here too," I said to Sandy, which was too much talk for two people with a pot between them. She lifted a shoulder. "For some. The little ones are always quiet or always yelling. The quiet ones don't need it, and the yelling ones don't care. Someone started something with whispering in the 4th grade. She waited, like she had more to say, and was measuring me to see if she had to. "They were saying names," she said, "hush-hush like. And then this one girl—" She stopped. She looked at her own hands. "Well, she went to the nurse. It was a whole thing." I nodded like someone wise would nod. On the drive up the hill to the high school, I wanted to throw the card out my window like a cigarette. I wanted to see it blow onto the ice-scarred grass by the salt barn and turn into confetti under the tires of the plow. I wanted to get in the walk-in and close the door and stand in the cold until my head quit. I drove the truck slow. The heater made a smell like old dust on a radiator. The radio had a man explaining the weather would come in like a roll of carpet. I turned it down. I turned it off. The superintendent sent a new directive. Bake sales were suspended. The choir would hum only. Band kids would practice fingering in silence. Parents were asked to keep the talk to a minimum at dinner. People in town said a lot of things into their phones and not to each other, and bought a run on those silly hourglass timers that go off after a minute. The Facebook groups ate themselves. The quiet set itself down and stayed. People who hated this kind of thing hated it. People who thought of themselves as helpful and strong loved it because it let them feel like they were containing something. People like me kept their heads down and ran their hands under hot water when they got cold, and did their jobs, and carried their cards in their pockets like stones. My mother got quieter in a way that wasn't the quiet I am telling you about. She ate better because I brought her small bowls more often. Her attention would land on an object, a spoon or a salt shaker, and stay there, as if the thing were a bird that had settled and she didn't want to startle it. I told her about the split shoe on the custodian S-cart and the way the boys in shop were making little benches that looked like tiny bridges, and she nodded like I was reading to her out of the paper. When the soup steamed up her glasses, she smiled because heat on her face meant she was still in her body. On a Sunday night when our heat clicked and clicked and then finally knocked off 3 times because the draft sensor had given up the ghost, I made soup with my mother asleep in her chair. I measured flour into the bowl like I was counting down and told myself I was doing it because soup was cheap and warm, and that was all. I washed my hands and dried them on the towel with the faded red stripe and put the towel back on its hook with a tenderness you reserve for a thing you don't want to lose. I felt the quiet enter the kitchen like someone coming into church late and not wanting to make the hinge creak. I held back from the radio with a little laugh at myself. I kneaded the dough until it got to that smoothness that makes you feel better than you have any right to. I kept silence after flour met water. I didn't say one name. I didn't think one name. I watched the pot's surface as if it were a window, and I was waiting to see myself go past in a coat I didn't own. The varnish formed anyway. It gathered itself from the edges in, a lake freezing from its rim until the center gives up. There was no voice that started it. There was no word in the room. The letters raised out of the glaze with a care that made me think of the way an older person writes neat, so you won't make them repeat it. Marcella. My mother's name looked pretty. It always did. The shape of it pleased the eye. It had a softness you don't often hear when people say it. I stood very still. The kitchen went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when you're too much in them. The varnish held. I put the ladle under it and lifted slow, and the sound it made on the metal was like the sound ice makes when you lean your weight on it on a shallow pond. The glaze slid into the ladle and stayed there, a name in amber that looked like something a person with tweezers could save. I brought the ladle back to the pot. I tipped it. The varnish went back into the soup like it had come from it. I breathed out through my nose. I heard that the dish machine cough in the back of my skull, even though I wasn't at work. I fed my mother. She ate. She slept with her mouth open in that way people do when their noses aren't doing the job. I kept looking at her as if looking were an action I could complete, like folding laundry or wiping the stove. The next day, she fell in the bathroom. It wasn't a big fall. She didn't crack anything. She had a bruise on her hip that came up like a map of an island you will never go to. The woman from the clinic said she was fine and not to panic, and I didn't, because I had to go to work and the kitchen doesn't care what kind of day you are having. Still, the name in the ladle lived in my head while I pulled the racks and counted the brownies and wiped down the steel. I thought of the phrase, keep the spout inside the pot, like it was a your turn thing. It started to feel like I was leaning against a door. Poppy was back on the Thursday with a heat patch stuck to her lower back under her shirt. She winced when she bent and made a joke about getting old at 39. She had a way of setting a tray down like it had insulted her. The kids had begun to whisper in their corridors, like they were practicing. You could hear the shape of it when you stood in the threshold of the kitchen. It moved like a small wind under the main noise of school. I told myself I wouldn't touch the pots anymore. I told myself I'd let the soup be soup. I told myself a lot of things you tell yourself when part of you doesn't believe in something and the other part is making a little space for it to be true. Paper cut, she said, because that is what it looked like, a long, neat slice that bled more than it had any right to. I said, sit, and then got the blue box and the little packets of gauze and tape that pull your skin like you are being punished. And we sat side by side on the white bucket we use when the drains smell wrong. The smell of bleach rose like a polite person to make itself known. I taped her finger and smelled pennies. You okay? I said, because that is what you say. She said, my sister's with him again. And the way she said him made a lot of sentences you could have said about a person and didn't. I saw her sister like a shape in a fog. I saw her in a red jacket she might not own, standing on the sidewalk outside the ferry, and a man standing with his hands in his pockets like men do when they are deciding if they will be men. I said, because humming is safe. She asked me to make soup, Poppy said, and she laughed, a little shudder more than a laugh. Says it makes her feel like a person. Soup, I said. I said it the way a person says the word for a small animal. Poppy looked at me. It was a look that has the question already moving through it like a fish. I didn't answer it, because you can imagine an answer will change something, and it will not. I went back to the stove. I kept my mouth shut and my mind as empty as I could. It turns out you can't empty a mind on purpose. It also turns out kitchens have a way of taking your quiet and moving it around. I stirred the pot and watched the surface like a lifeguard. The varnish formed the way a habit forms. I lifted the ladle and took it in. I held a name in it that hadn't been said. It slid in and out of the pot like a fish too tired to argue about the net. I told myself the names would keep coming, and it had nothing to do with the silence or the noise and everything to do with me, with my being the kind of person who lives close to the surface of his work. There are things you tell no one, because to say them makes you think they become true in a way they were not, before your voice did that. I told no one that a boy from the junior class had said a name at his lunch table as a joke, and then gone white around the mouth when his buddy knocked the table with his knee, and the boy soup made a skin that held. I told no one that I saw a teacher stand with her hand on the microwave like you might if you wanted your hand to know what heat is, and then say her own name very quiet, and then shake her head at herself and laugh the laugh of people who find they can still be stupid at any age. I told no one that I took the card out of my pocket and put it back again 10 times a day and smelled the faint metal in it like a warning you can pretend is a memory. A week before winter break, the town ran lights on the lampposts that made the wet snow glow a little under the sodium. The football banquet went off without anyone arguing into a microphone. The superintendent cut the ribbon on the new scoreboard with its bright red digits, and a line of kids in jackets cheered because you don't get many ribbon cuttings out here. The quiet was supposed to lift on Friday. We had a shipment of oranges and the paper cups with reindeer noses, and a plan to make cocoa if the hot water stayed honest. In my pocket I carried the card and a second card ID written in my own slow all caps with a Sharpie, because I am that kind of person. Keep the spout inside the pot. I planned to make my mother chicken broth with little letters in it from the box, because she liked to spell half a word and leave it sitting on her tongue like a marble. I planned to sit with her and watch the shadow of the pole go over the driveway and tell her the story about the little benches again, because she liked to imagine the shop teacher belly up against the workbench, a detail she repeated as if it was what made the bench hold. I planned to put the box in the back of the cupboard behind the pan I never use, and to be someone who quietly returns to a superstition without telling himself that is what it is. In the kitchen, the day before the quiet was to lift, the dish machine didn't cough. It stopped. You know at once when a thing that is supposed to make noise has stopped making noise. The room goes open in a way you don't expect. I stood with a tray in my hands and listened to the sound of the pump not pumping. Poppy stood with a stack of cups and heard the silence too. The dish machine's little ready light blinked the same way it always blinked, and the chain on the pass-through sagged heavy, but the absence of the hum was louder than the presence of any talk. I put the tray on the rack and pressed the button, and the machine told me no with a flat line you hear in hospitals on television. I squatted and looked at the underbelly, the line where the water feeds in and the drain feeds out. A kitchen is a map of lines. You learn to see the currents. "You want me to call Ray?" Poppy said, but she said it like she knew Ray had already gone home to sit on his bathroom step and smoke out the window like he did. I flipped the breaker on the wall, and the box did the thing machines do, where they wake like a person who has been yelled at and then remember why they were sleeping. The motor coughed and turned and stopped. The light blinked. The room filled with the smell of hot water sitting too long. If you want a metaphor for anything, a kitchen will give you one. We had trays to wash and kids to feed and a policy to uphold, and I wanted to say a name to see if the soup would hold it, and I wanted not to be the kind of person who wanted that. Instead, I said, "Hand me the wrench," and the wrench was in my hand and the chain was in my other, and the machine is not a creature and has no patience for drama. I pulled the strainer and found it full of the things people leave on plates. Plastic straw wrappers rolled into little lozenges, the crumple of a paper napkin, a piece of tape we used to label a Cambro with someone S pretty, writing all blurred now. And I picked them out and put them in a heap and felt proud the way you do when you have done something with your hands. When I put the strainer back, the machine started and then stopped and then started and clanked and then stopped in a way that told me we were done with it for the day. "What now?" Poppy said. And it wasn't a question. Ray came and stood with me and looked at the machine like two men will look at a broken animal. He took off a knuckle of pipe and found a bit of wire in the teeth of the pump, and we both said, "Huh," in the same tone. "Got a part downtown?" I said. He shook his head. "Tomorrow," he said, and the word was another of those bandages. We washed dishes by hand like people do when the machine goes quiet. We filled the 3-compartment sink and sanitized and stacked and let them air, which is against health code. The health code wants to be sure there is heat. The health code wants you to have tumbling water and a recording of every day, nest temp, on a sheet signed at the bottom. But the health code does not stand at the sink with its fingers wrinkling, and it does not look up at the clock and count the minutes down until the first bus lets off and the children come in with their coats open, because children think they are invulnerable, and maybe they are. Poppy and I did the work of 2 machines, and the heat that came up from the sink made the little hairs on our faces curl. The kitchen got quiet, not because we wanted it, but because that is what work sometimes demands. I ladled soup. I kept the spout inside the pot because that is how you learned you were who you were now. I didn't say a name. No one said a name. The varnish formed anyway for a second, a flash like the blink of a fish, and then thinned and went. I felt a relief that I don't have a good word for. It was both small and total. In the afternoon, the superintendent came on the speaker with the principal and told us we had done our community a service, and the quiet would lift as of the morning, and people were to return to their normal routines. He used the word normal like it was a prize we had won. People clapped in their small, private ways. Poppy put a stack of cups down too hard and smiled like she had stolen something and gotten away with it. I put the last tray on the last rack and listened to the building exhale. I went home and made soup for my mother. I kept the spout inside the pot. I watched the varnish do its little lagoon trick, and I moved the ladle in the warm, like a priest at the font. And then I fed my mother and held my mug and pretended not to notice she drank slower than she had started drinking 2 weeks ago when the quiet began. In the night at 3:24, by the clock on the stove that flashes when the power goes, my mother woke with a sound that was half cough and half her saying my name. And I put my hand on her shoulder and felt the heat in her skin, and knew the clinic would say not to bring her in unless there was labored breathing, and I listened to her breathe until it smoothed. And I told myself stories about the card disintegrating in the cupboard behind the pan I never use. In the morning I put the card in my pocket. I have nothing good to tell you about that choice. I took the city bus because my car wouldn't turn over without me turning it over too. The driver nodded, and the heater blew air that smelled like its own breath. In the kitchen, Ray had gotten the pump to go, and the dish machine came back to itself with a burp and a shake, like it had dreamed it was drowning and startled in its sleep. The radio was on in the main office, and I could hear the principal laugh. Poppy stood with a spoon in the tomato soup and hummed under her breath. The first lunch with the quiet gone felt heavier than it should have. The kids came in loud in the way kids are when they have been quiet too long. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief, it was muscle. They pushed the sound of their own talk like a weight they had to move. The scrape of chairs came back, and the bells on backpacks, and the buzz of voices climbing up and over each other like weeds. The dish machine coughed, and it sounded like a person again. A boy at the third table laughed too loud, and the echo in the room did a thing with his laugh that made it sound like a call. I remember ladling. I remember the way my hands knew the size of the mouth of the cup without my eyes. I remember the smell of basil from the pot. I remember the texture of the varnish when it formed, slick and soft and wrong as always. I remember the ladle. I remember the spout inside the pot. A girl near the end of the line had the knit hat on her head, the one pulled down to her eyebrows. She had a small scar on her top lip and half a smile you only saw when she set her tray down, like a waitress in training. She leaned near the boy next to her and said a name into his ear, and then said, "No, this one," and then said the name louder because the room was loud and people want to be heard. There is nothing in me that thinks my ladle or my silence or the card made her say it. There is nothing in me that doesn't. Her voice had already gone into the air. The pot was only a pot. I tell you I watched the surface of the soup, and I tell you I saw the varnish. And I tell you it took the name in its teeth and raised it with the care of a person writing on the back of their hand, so they won't lose the number. I tell you the name wasn't her name. I tell you it was the name of the boy she said it to. I tell you... He laughed his too loud laugh into the air, even as the letter formed in my ladle, as I kept it under, and then lifted and tipped and kept the spout inside like the card said. The boy didn't die. He didn't choke. He ate his tomato soup with the way of a person who has no relationship to the word yet. He bit the reindeer nose on the cup. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and used the napkin to wipe the table like a person who wants to be good at something and does not know where to start. That night, there was a police car on his street for a little while, and a door opened and closed, and people looked through their blinds. My mother fell again the next day. It was bigger this time. She hit her head. The bruise came up under her hair where I couldn't see it, and then I could see it in the way she kept her eyes somewhere other than where the wall was. The clinic said, "Bring her in." I took her. We waited under the hiss of fluorescent lights that had to be replaced every year in December because the cold bit them. I had the card in my pocket and took it out in the bathroom and didn't look at it and put it back. A man in the waiting room cleared his throat, and the sound was the dish machine sound. I wanted to be in my kitchen, where I knew what to do when things made the wrong noises. They kept her overnight. They wanted to see if she knew the names. She knew mine, and that is it. A nurse with a ponytail that swung like a metronome told me they would discharge her in the morning if she ate. I went home and made soup alone in the quiet and put her name back into the pot and kept the spout inside and understood that this is not how you save a person. I took a bowl to the hospital in a thermos because the vending machine looked like a washed-out mouth and the cafeteria had closed for the night. The nurse told me I couldn't to bring outside food, and then told me she didn't to see it, and then I sat next to my mother and held the cup and watched her not be hungry. The superintendent resigned on a Tuesday. He said he wanted more time with his family. The board thanked him for his service, and people clapped in that small way. The principal became acting superintendent, and the acting principal kept his hands folded on the table. Poppy came in late 3 days in a row because her sister had taken the bus downriver and not come back on the one she said she would. The boy, from the day the quiet lifted, didn't come to school. I heard his mother on the phone with the office saying they were with an aunt. We put oranges in reindeer cups. The dish machine made its cough. The names came and went in the varnish, and I kept the spout inside. I didn't say one thing about any of it to anyone because what would you say? I stopped turning on the radio. The card in my pocket started to feel heavier than a card should be. I heard people in line say the word curse, and I heard people say the word gas, and I heard one science teacher say the word sublimation, as if that would wrap it up. I heard the school board say the word liability and the word mitigation. I heard the shop teacher say the word bullshit in the parking lot to the gym teacher, and they both laughed too loud. I heard a woman in line at the Dollar World say, "It's because of the salt," and then laugh like she had told herself a joke. On the Friday before break, the kitchen got too hot, and the windows fogged, and the fluorescent lights made halos in the damp, like we were in a church that had decided to be a sauna. The kids were loud and tired, and some of them had the edge a person gets when they have not eaten enough fruit in a month. Poppy had her hand on her back. I moved slower than a man my age should. The dish machine coughed, and the radio was off, and the world was the world. I lifted the ladle and saw a name that made my stomach drop, like I had stepped into a missing stair. It was a name I had not said out loud in a very long time. It was the name of a person who could walk into a room and make a shelf right to a hair and then leave before the nails remembered to hold. It was the name of a person who had left his boots by the door like he would come back to them. The letters were neat and easy and somehow pleased with themselves. Sale. I tipped the varnish back into the pot and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, and the smell of pennies lingered on my thumb. I ladled for the kids and then stood in the dish pit and breathed the bleach and told myself a list of chores. You will empty the strainer. You will pull the racks. You will fill the red sanitizer bucket and put the red bucket under the table where no one trips on it. You will call your mother, you will. I called my mother. She didn't answer. The nurse called back and said she was resting and could I bring her slippers from home because she was tired of the hospital ones. I said I could. Then I went out to the loading dock and looked at the tracks of a fox in the thin snow by the salt barn and watched them go onto the road because foxes know how to cross, and also they done tea. On Sunday night, a car sat in our driveway with the headlights on. It idled its old engine, and the exhaust made a white ghost by the back steps that drifted and went. The phone lit on the counter with a number I didn't want to see, and I didn't answer, because I knew if I answered I would say a name, and if I said a name, it would exist in a way it didn't need to. My mother, home from the hospital because there is nothing you can do for a bruise in a brain, but wait and hope it fades with the fog, slept in her chair with her mouth open. I stood at the window and looked at the car. The headlights made my blinds bright, and the slats shadowed the wall in lines that looked like jail. My hands did what they do when I am scared. They moved to the kitchen. The pot was out before I knew I was moving. The water rolled and I rolled flour into it. The silence came into the room like a person walking in and taking off a coat they want you to notice. I told myself I like cooking. I told myself this is what you do when life walks back into your driveway after winter. I told myself the spout would stay inside the pot. I kept silence after flour met water. I made it a vow I could feel in my throat. The car in the drive clicked as it cooled, even though it was idling. The engine had that sound old engines have when they are holding on. I lifted the lid and saw a varnish that formed quicker than it had any right to. I lifted the ladle and the letters were there the way letters are once we carved them in a tree. S-A-L. There are names that belong to you, even if they do not act like they do. The ladle took them. The ladle brought them to the spout. The ladle tipped. The varnish slid back into the pot like it had been made there and nowhere else. The door to the driveway opened. It opened slow, like the person on the other side had no reason to hurry. I stood with the ladle inside the pot like a person holding a shield that isn't T1. He stepped into the kitchen like a man who had stepped into many kitchens and acted as if they were his. He looked older and not older. He had the look of someone who has smiled enough that his mouth can find the shape, even when there's nothing to smile about. He put his hands in his pockets the way men do when they are deciding if they will be men. "Marco," he said. And he said my name in a way that made me remember being small enough to sit on the counter and hold the measuring cup until my hand got tired. He smelled like cold and car and something a little sweet I did not name. He looked at my mother and then looked away like the sight was a hot thing. He looked at the pot and smiled in a way that told me he saw the past. "Smells good," he said. He took his hands out of his pockets and put them flat on the counter like he was claiming the room. I kept the ladle inside the pot. I kept the spout inside the pot. I said nothing. I nodded, and the nod was a stiff thing. "Got something to tell you," he said, and his tone was the tone of men who bring their news like they have done you a favor by deciding to carry it. I made a noise that wasn't a word. He stepped closer. He put one hand on the back of the chair my mother's coat hung over. He said my mother's name in a whisper that felt like a wrong prayer. The varnish in the pot thickened under my hand like a person blood when the air hits it. I tipped the ladle. I kept the spout inside the pot. He told me something with his mouth that I already knew. He told me he had lost a job. He told me he was about to get back. He told me he needed a place to stay for a bit. He used the word bit as if it were a small stone not worth holding. I kept the ladle in the soup. The varnish in the pot did its work. He stepped around me. He reached for the radio knob because that is what he does. He takes the room's noise in his hands. He turned it up. The commercial voice said the word guarantee again, and it felt like we had never had a quiet in this house. He turned the volume down and then off and then on again, like he was testing a light. "You still use this old thing," he said, like he was giving me an opportunity to impress him. The ladle in my hand was heavy. The varnish wanted out. It wanted to lift. I held it down because the card said to keep the spout inside the pot. I kept silence with a hardness that made me feel stupid and holy at once. My mother slept, her mouth open, the heat working on her skin. My father put the radio on so low it was a buzz, and then leaned against the counter like he belonged to it. He reached toward the pot with 2 fingers like he was a boy stealing a piece of pasta. "Let me taste," he said. His fingers touched the surface and the varnish took them, made a skin that held between his fingertips like bubble gum, and then broke. He flinched and laughed so he wouldn't be seen flinching. "Hot," he said, in the tone people use when they have to speak in a room where someone else is speaking. I breathed out. I lifted the ladle. The varnish slid back into the pot. The letters did their slow dissolve. The radio talked. He told me more. None of it mattered. It was the old story. It was the bench right to a hair and the boots by the door. It was a different woman in a different place and the same person telling me it would not be like before. It was the word bit and the word until and the word buddy. It was the names our lives had become when the quiet was visiting the town. Only now, the radio spoke over them. He stayed 3 nights on the couch and then left for an hour, and didn't he come back for 2 days. My mother asked where he was with her mouth and not her voice, and I said he had gone down to the river town, the one with the ferry, and she nodded because that town holds what it holds. I took soup to the hospital for no one. I made soup at home. I kept the spout inside the pot. I thought if there was a promise in the card, it was to hold something where it couldn't get purchase. On the morning he came back, he was drunk. He put his boots in the same place, and they looked like they had always been there. He smiled, and his smile was something that used to work. He turned the radio up and danced a little in the kitchen like there was a woman in his head. He bumped the towel on the hook and it fell. I put the towel back and thought about taking the card out and burning it. I thought about the smell of the smoke. I thought about how some smells get in the paint and won't leave. He looked at the pot and said my mother's name, not quiet, and the varnish that formed in the air, not on the pot, caught his attention like a moth. He reached for it. I moved the ladle. The varnish hit the metal with a sound I will hear when the noise of everything else is gone. I tipped the ladle. The spout stayed in the pot. His mouth made a shape that wasn't a word. He looked at me like I had left. When the radio made a song he liked, his mouth made a smile, and the smile looked like a person you remember and don't want to see anymore. He left that afternoon, the way he leaves. He took nothing. The boots stayed by the door for a day, and then I put them in the hall, and then the hall made me feel like I had done wrong, and I put them back. The soup cooled. My mother watched the pole shadow. The dish machine at the school coughed in my head. I lay in bed and thought of the varnish like it was ice over a pond, very deep and very shallow at once. After winter break, the quiet didn't come back, not officially. There were days, like the day the middle school had a gas leak, and everyone stood outside in the cold and breathed through their mouths and said nothing. There were days when the choir hummed a carol because the teacher had given up. There were days when the line was loud with kids who had been inside all weekend because the plows ganged up on our side of town last. The soup came and went. The varnish formed and sometimes did not. The spout stayed inside the pot. Poppyone's sister came back from the river town with a new scar and a necklace with a different man's name on it, which she laughed about and kept anyway. The boy from the day the quiet lifted moved to his Aunt S for real, and then moved back because the aunt moved in with the Aunt's daughter's boyfriend. The superintendent's replacement said a sentence about moving forward, and people clapped like they were done clapping for words. The new scoreboard failed on the first night of basketball because a wire inside it was pinched at the factory. The old scoreboard went back into service without comment. I made soup. I kept silence after flour met water, even when it wasn't a policy. It felt less like a vow and more like the way I hold my breath when I walk past the old plant, because it smells like wet stone. You make the motion for yourself. You keep your spout inside your pot. You put the ladle in and you lift it out the way you've done since the first time you learned you could change the shape of hunger. You clean the stove. You pull the racks. You take the trash out to the loading dock and look across at the salt barn and the quiet field beyond and the old fence plant with its mute stacks, and imagine the world as it is not quite being the world you were in. When my mother had her last fall, it was a small one. It was the kind that makes you want to call it nothing so that it won TB something. She reached for a towel. The towel wasn't there. She turned, and her foot scuffed the mat, and the mat didn't catch because its little suction cups had grown slick with time. She sat on the edge of the tub, and then she wasn't sitting. The bruise came up like an island. She said my name without saying it. I made soup because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I kept silence after flour met water. I kept the spout inside the pot. When the varnish formed and took her name, I held it in the ladle and looked at it long enough that it started to look like not letters, just bumps and shines, the way a familiar word will become strange if you look at it long enough. I tipped it back. She ate. She slept. She woke and did not know the pole shadow from the driveway, and then she did, and laughed at me for telling her the time. I took the card and put it in the trash and took the trash out and did not look back. The lid shut on it like closing your own mouth. The next morning in the kitchen I made tomato soup and stirred and didn't look at the surface and didn't keep the spout inside the pot. It felt false to look away. It felt honest not to test it anymore. When I tipped the ladle, the varnish slid off the metal and onto the counter in a smear the color of old amber, and in the smear was a name I didn't know. The letters were neat. The sound the varnish made when it hit the steel was the sound of the dish machine clearing its throat. I wiped the smear with my sleeve, and my sleeve shone, and my forearm smelled like pennies. A boy in a red hoodie came to the end of the line and asked for 2 of the reindeer cups, 1 for his friend, and I handed them to him and he said thanks, and I said uh-huh. And when I turned to put the ladle back, the varnish repeated itself on the surface, the name raised and then flattening like all the names I had seen before had been practicing for this. The name wasn't Poppy. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't Sal. It wasn't anyone I could fit into a door. It had too many letters and not enough. I turned the radio on to drown out the silence inside me, and then I turned it off because the buzz was like bees in a jar. I kept the spout inside the pot. I kept it out. I ladled like a person who had forgotten how to do anything else. After lunch, Poppy leaned against the wall and rubbed her lower back and said, "You ever think maybe we don't need to understand a thing to know what to do with it?" She said it like she was talking about a new piece of equipment or an old man who never picks up his feet. "You hold it long enough," she said, "and it holds you back." Then she laughed because the sentence sounded like a thing people might say on the radio. I nodded. I emptied the strainer. I pulled the racks. I put the knives back on the magnetic strip like grey fish swimming in a line. I locked the loading dock door with a turn that took 2 fingers. I walked out past the salt barn and the old fence plant and the empty lot where the kids once burned a couch and got in trouble and were proud. The air smelled like iron and the sky was the color of dirty snow you have forgotten to shovel. I went home and fed my mother and stood in the kitchen with a pot on the stove and a ladle in my hand, and the feeling in my chest you get when a storm is not yet and the pressure changes the way the dog knows it. I kept silence. After flour met water. The house went the way it goes when a person who speaks appears to have gone for a walk and not come back. The radio's plug was wound tight. The doors eased shut. The steam ghosted the window and left streaks like writing, then slid away. I worked with my hands. I let the varnish make its little pond. I put the spout inside the pot until it didn't itty matter, and then I took it out and watched the way the soup looked when there was no silence around it. My mother slept with her mouth open. Across town, the dish machine coughed in an empty kitchen. The scoreboard in the gym blinked 12 and 12, and then went dark and came back. In the pot, the varnish became a word and lost it and became one again, and then decided not to need the spoon. I stood there in my kitchen, a man with his hands around something that did not belong to anyone, and when the first snow of January started, you could hear it at the window like a shaker on a drum. The next morning, the kids were late on account of the buses, and the line started as a knot at the door and turned into a rope out the hallway. I ladled. I kept the spout inside the pot. I thought of the card in the landfill under the lid that shuts like a mouth. I thought of the words we put into the air in this town and the ones we kept underwater. I thought of how there is no real finish to this story, because the work does not finish, and the varnish forms when it wants to and slides when it wants to, and the names are the names whether you witness them or not. When my shift was done, I went home, and my mother opened her eyes, and the pole shadow slid its way across the driveway like it had every day that had a pole. And I stood in the kitchen and kept my hands busy until the heat clicked and decided to hold. And outside, the salt truck grumbled down Fulson Road chain, clinking against tailgate. And somewhere up the hill, a fox moved through the snow with its little decisions. And the pot on my stove steamed like a quiet breath you can feel but not see. and the ladle in my hand stood in it like something that might be saving us and might be only itself. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.